But let's answer the question, what is a podcast? In the most basic sense, a podcast is just internet radio. It's an audio blog that's hosted on an RSS feed. Now, an RSS feed, we'll get into the technicals of that in a little bit, but I also call podcasts, it's the number one form of secondary entertainment, meaning you don't find many people who just kind of sit in an empty room and listen to a podcast. I'm sure they're out there, but podcasts are done while you're doing something else. Like I said, on the ride over here, I was driving, listening to a podcast, cooking dinner, listening to a podcast. Anywhere else, anywhere you would normally listen to music, that is where you can listen to a podcast. The most common place people listen to podcasts is on the commute to work. On the bus, before I hop on the bus to go into work, listen to a podcast. And in 2021, 116 million Americans listen to a podcast monthly. And that's up from 67 million in 2017. So podcasting is an ever growing industry. So I'm glad you are interested. I'm glad you have a passion for it. And it's still emerging. Podcasting has been around since 2004. But it's still kind of in its infancy. I started in 2015 and things are way different now than they were then. But also podcasts, this is an easy way to remember what a podcast is. A podcast is a personally or professionally oriented discussion centered around select topics. Now, that is a Will Tarashuk original. That is something I came up with all by myself because I am a big boy. That's the podcast acronym. If someone ever asks you what a podcast is, it is a personal or professionally oriented discussion centered around select topics. And the P is the most important part of that acronym. The P stands for personal or professional. And that's really where I kind of got to draw a line down the middle for this whole series, where some of the advice, tips, and tricks I give are going to apply to a personal podcast, meaning you're an individual. It's a hobby. You try to make some extra cash off Patreon or YouTube's ads or what have you. Or it's professional, where you're a business trying to get lead gen, marketing, sell a product, promote your product. It's very more, professional, for lack of a better word. Then oriented discussion, it's something orient means you're centered around. You're centered around a discussion and also centered around select topics, meaning you're talking about a specific topic or topics. The plural in the topics is also very, very important because an example of this acronym is my podcast, the Talking with Tarashuk podcast. It's very personal to me because I am the host. My name is in the title. And I talk about whatever I generally find interesting. The podcast is personal to me. It is a discussion-based podcast. And what that means is discussion-based is, I call it, it's the bar treatment. You sit down with your friends at a bar or your girlfriend or your significant other, and you just talk. You don't really think about what you're talking about. You just talk, and whatever comes up, comes up. Christian, you can relate to this. You are my co-host on the Talking with Tarashuk podcast, and things, we don't normally have a plan. It's just discussion-based. We just kind of talk and shoot the breeze.
Absolutely. I mean, we have a list of questions. It's unknown, unnamed nonsense segment where we're asking random questions, but oftentimes we'll go off on a tangent.
Yeah.
For 10, 15 minutes, it's like, what, I have a follow-up question, or what do you think about such? What do you think about this? So, yeah.
Yeah, the list of random questions is what we are centered around, right? We are centered around where if we have nothing to talk about or we kind of get lost or the topic kind of just runs its course, we're right back to list of questions.
But bottom line, it's the conversation takes precedent over the questions.
Definitely.
Probably.
Definitely.
A good conversation, good topics, that type of thing keeps the ball rolling.
Yeah, like if we just hop in a studio and we start recording and we don't ask a question for 45 minutes, that's a success.
Yeah.
If anything, it's even better.
I mean, at first I was like, oh, we didn't get through that many questions. It's like, well, that means that we were just in a vibe. The chemistry was there, and that's even better.
And the questions are something I completely come up with on my own. For the most part, I encourage people to answer questions.
I've added a few.
Yeah, a few.
Here and there.
And
probably about 10 out of 200, but
if you listen to the podcast, submit your questions. I promise you, I will ask them and I will give you credit. If they're too ridiculous, I just won't ask them. And I reserve that right because it's a personal podcast. The P stands for personal. But it's also a business podcast, right? The discussion can focus on anything, albeit sports, medicine, law, entertainment. Because another part of Talking with Tarashuk podcast is I interview people. I have a traditional 101, this is what your typical podcast is, where we sit down either in this studio if they're remote, local, or we're remote over Zoom and the internet, where like next week I have an author on. She is a writer about, she is an English business coach based in Germany, and she just released a book on the World Cup. So I was like, ooh, that's interesting. And if I go, ooh, that's interesting, I go, well, I guess I'm bringing you on my podcast.
And I think that's where it doesn't have to be near perfect acronym here, Will, personally or professionally. But for you, it actually is kind of somewhat of a hybrid.
Exactly.
You have a little bit of both.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes it's professional interviews of people in topic of interest, industry, or whatever.
Yeah.
And then sometimes it's just us messing around and us talking about what we find interesting.
And you as a listener, you as an audience, you get the choice. You can listen to one, you can listen to both, or you can just go with the clips. You know, a big thing of my podcasting philosophy is, and as a listener, as a host, as a producer, is the most important thing is choice. You have a choice, listen to whatever you want on whatever platform you want. You know, exclusivity is dead in podcasts. It's going to be a big theme of this series. There's going to be a lot of themes of the series. But yeah, that is the podcast acronym. The most important letters being P and T, because topics can mean whatever you want it to mean. Personal, professional can be whatever you want it to mean. You know, you don't need to follow my advice word for word. You know, a lot of these things in this course also is going to be based on facts. You know, how to edit something on Adobe Audition is a fact. The strengths and weaknesses of this microphone are arguably a fact. But how you structure and format your podcast is not a fact. There is no right or wrong answer. There is no industry standard to tell you what to do and not do. The most successful podcasts are nothing like you would see on traditional media, which is stuff you see on network television, or even Netflix or Hulu or anything else that's out there, or even terrestrial radio like Howard Stern, or like Opie and Anthony, who it used to be, or sports talk radio or radio DJs. There's a specific standard and format they have to follow based off ads and audiences and music. Podcasting is this, like, you can throw all that out the window.
And I'd like to add something.
Please.
Right now, this is a podcast. It's audio and video.
Yeah.
That's another decision that can be made.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you obviously have to be audio capable, but video is a plus. It's a perk. Add some visuals. But it doesn't have to be. So it's all subjective.
It's 1,000% subjective. And that's the point. That's really the point I'm trying to hammer home here. Is that it is all subjective. And you really just can do whatever you want to do. And that's the glory of it.